$118,000. Not $100,000. Not $1 million. A ransom demand so specific, investigators couldn't figure out why. Detectives have read thousands of ransom notes. This is the one they still can't fully explain. 3 handwritten pages, nearly 400 words, written on paper from inside the Ramsey home, with a pen found there. Hours later, the 6-year-old girl the note claimed was still alive was found dead, hidden inside that same house. The investigation changed instantly. Detectives stopped asking who kidnapped JonBenét Ramsey. They started asking who wrote 3 pages that raised more questions than they answered. Nearly 30 years later, her murder remains officially unsolved. But tonight, we're not investigating who killed JonBenét Ramsey. We're investigating whether 3 handwritten pages can tell us who wrote them and why. Long before television cameras surrounded the Ramsey home, before headlines turned a family's tragedy into one of America's most debated murder cases, there was simply a little girl named JonBenét. She was 6 years old. Friends remembered her as energetic, outgoing, and full of personality. She loved performing. She loved dressing up. She loved making people laugh. Home videos captured the ordinary moments that every family hopes they'll never forget. Birthday parties, holidays, and afternoons filled with laughter. Her father, John Ramsey, was the president of Access Graphics, a successful technology company based in Colorado. Colleagues described him as disciplined and methodical, a businessman whose career had brought financial success to the family. Her mother, Patsy Ramsey, was a former beauty queen who devoted much of her life to raising her children. She was deeply involved in JonBenét's activities and worked hard to create memorable holidays and family traditions. JonBenét also had an older brother, Burke. Like many families, the Ramseys weren't perfect. No family is. But to neighbors and friends, they appeared close. Their home reflected the excitement of Christmas. Lights decorated the windows. Presents surrounded the tree. Plans had already been made for another family celebration the following day. Nothing about Christmas Day suggested it would become one of the last normal days the family would ever have. And that's what makes this case so haunting. Because evil doesn't announce itself. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, in the middle of an ordinary night. December 25th, 1996. For the Ramseys, the day unfolded much like it did for millions of families across America. The children woke early to open presents. Boxes were torn apart. Wrapping paper covered the floor. New toys quickly replaced old ones. Photographs captured smiling faces gathered around the Christmas tree. Later that day, the family attended a holiday dinner with friends. They laughed. They ate together. Nothing appeared unusual. When the evening ended, the Ramseys returned home. The children were tired after a full day of excitement. According to the family's accounts, JonBenét was asleep by the time they arrived home, and John carried her to bed. The house gradually grew quiet. Outside, boulders settled into the stillness of a cold December night. Inside, Christmas lights continued glowing softly in the darkness. It was the kind of peaceful scene people remember for the rest of their lives. Not because they knew something terrible was coming, but because they didn't. No one knows exactly what happened inside the Ramsey home during the hours that followed. No witness has ever come forward to describe those final moments. No surveillance camera recorded them. Instead, investigators were left with fragments, physical evidence, conflicting interpretations, and one document that would become more famous than almost any ransom note in American history. At approximately 5:30 on the morning of December 26th, Patsy Ramsey woke up. The family was preparing to leave for another holiday trip. As she walked downstairs, something caught her attention. 3 handwritten pages rested on one of the staircase steps. She stopped. At first, The papers didn't seem unusual. Then she began to read. The message claimed JonBenét had been kidnapped. It warned the family not to contact law enforcement. It instructed John Ramsey to withdraw $118,000. If the instructions weren't followed, the writer threatened that JonBenét would be harmed. For a brief moment, those pages carried hope. As terrifying as the message was, it suggested one thing every parent desperately wants to believe: that their child is still alive. Patsy immediately called for John. Together, they rushed to JonBenét's bedroom. The bed was empty. She wasn't there. Panic replaced disbelief. Within minutes, Patsy made a decision that would later become one of the most discussed moments in the case. Despite the note's warning not to involve police, she dialed 911. At 5:52 a.m., the emergency operator answered. Patsy's voice was strained and urgent. She reported that her daughter had been kidnapped. She explained there was a ransom note. Police officers were dispatched immediately. Soon after, friends and family members also arrived at the house to support the Ramseys. The home, which investigators would later need to process as a crime scene, quickly filled with people. At that moment, no one believed they were standing inside the scene of a homicide. Everyone believed they were searching for a missing child. The ransom note had framed the story. It had given everyone, including police, a starting point. But as the morning wore on, that story would begin to unravel, because hidden somewhere inside that house was a truth no one had yet discovered. Detectives arrived believing someone had taken JonBenét Ramsey from her home. By the end of the day, they would discover she had never left it. So why? Was there a ransom note at all? When Boulder police officers arrived at the Ramsey home shortly before 6 o'clock that morning, they believed they were responding to a kidnapping. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The ransom note described a child who had supposedly been taken from her bedroom during the night. It warned against contacting police. It demanded money. And it implied that somewhere outside the house, a kidnapper was waiting. At that moment, there was no reason to believe otherwise. The officers secured the home as best they could under the circumstances. They interviewed John and Patsy Ramsey separately, asking them to recount the previous evening. Friends who had arrived to support the family remained inside the house. Some comforted Patsy. Others searched rooms and checked windows. Looking back, investigators would later acknowledge that the scene quickly became crowded, far more crowded than would be considered ideal for preserving potential evidence. But it's important to remember why. They weren't treating the house as the scene of a murder. They believed time was running out to rescue a child. According to the ransom note, the kidnappers would make contact after John Ramsey gathered the money. The family waited. Police waited. Hours passed. The phone never rang. Every minute without a call made the situation harder to explain. If this was truly a kidnapping, why wasn't anyone asking for the ransom? Investigators searched the home again, not as a full forensic examination, but to look for anything that might help explain what had happened. Still, there was no sign of JonBenét, no indication that she had walked away on her own, no obvious evidence pointing to where she might have been taken. The house seemed to offer no answers, until one detective made a simple request. By early afternoon, Detective Linda Arndt had been inside the Ramsey home for several hours. With no call from the supposed kidnappers, she asked John Ramsey and a family friend to search the house again. Not because she believed JonBenét was inside, but because experienced investigators know that fresh eyes sometimes notice what others miss. John began moving through the rooms. Eventually, he walked toward a little-used basement area. At the end of a hallway, he opened the door to a small storage room. Inside, he found JonBenét. She was lying on the floor. She was no longer alive. John picked up his daughter and carried her upstairs. It was an act born from grief, but investigators would later explain that moving the body also changed the crime scene, making later forensic reconstruction more difficult. In a matter of seconds, the investigation transformed. This was no longer a kidnapping. It was a homicide investigation. And the 3-page letter that had dictated the morning's events would now be examined as evidence, not instructions. The discovery forced investigators to reconsider almost everything they thought they knew. If JonBenét had never been removed from the house, then what was the purpose of the ransom note? Was it written before the crime? After it? Was it meant to delay investigators? To misdirect them? Or did it serve another purpose entirely? The answers weren't obvious, and the note itself wasn't offering many. Instead, it was creating even more questions, because before detectives could decide who might have written it, they first had to understand what kind of ransom note they were looking at. Most ransom notes are surprisingly short. This one was anything but. The average ransom note is measured in sentences. This one was measured in pages. Detectives had now crossed into a very different investigation. The question was no longer where JonBenét Ramsey had gone. She had been found. The question was whether the 3 pages left behind had ever been a genuine ransom note at all. To answer that, investigators did something deceptively simple. They started reading, not as frightened parents, not as people searching for hope, but as evidence. And almost immediately, the note began to stand out. Most ransom notes have one purpose: tell the victim's family what to do. Nothing more. The longer a kidnapper spends writing, the longer they remain at risk of being caught. Investigators have long noted that ransom demands are typically brief and focused on logistics: proof the victim is alive, how much money is required, and instructions for making the exchange. The Ramsey note didn't follow that pattern. It stretched across 3 handwritten pages, nearly 400 words. Instead of getting straight to the point, it wandered through warnings, explanations, and dramatic language. It threatened consequences, repeated instructions, explained motives, and spent considerable time saying things a kidnapper didn't necessarily need to say. That didn't prove the note wasn't genuine. Unusual isn't the same as impossible, but it did raise an important question. Why spend so much time writing, when every extra minute inside the house increased the risk of being discovered? Then detectives reached a line that stopped them. The ransom demand: $118,000. At first glance, it might not seem strange. Kidnappers ask for money. That's what ransom notes do. But investigators noticed something about the amount. It wasn't rounded. Not $100,000. Not $250,000. Not even $1 million. It was exact. That precision caught their attention. As the investigation continued, detectives learned that John Ramsey had received a holiday bonus from his employer earlier that year in approximately that amount. The discovery immediately became one of the most discussed details in the case. What did it mean? There wasn't a single answer. Some investigators considered the amount significant because it suggested familiarity with John's finances. Others cautioned that, by itself, the figure could not identify who wrote the note or why that amount was chosen. The number was intriguing, but it wasn't proof. It was another question, one that investigators couldn't easily dismiss. As forensic examiners continued processing the scene, they made another discovery. The paper used for the note came from a notepad inside the Ramsey home. The pen used to write it also belonged to the household. Investigators also documented what appeared to be an abandoned practice start on the same notepad before the final version was written. That finding changed the way many investigators thought about the note. Whoever wrote it appeared to have spent time inside the house, long enough to locate writing materials, begin writing, start over, and complete 3 handwritten pages. Exactly how long that process took has been debated. But writing a note of that length was unlikely to have been instantaneous. That realization introduced a new question. If someone had enough time to write all of this, why? The deeper investigators looked, the less the note resembled a simple set of demands. It almost seemed to be trying to do something else. Not just tell the Ramseys what to do, but shape how the crime would be understood. Some investigators viewed that possibility as important. Others urged caution, arguing that unusual wording alone couldn't reveal a writer's intentions. The evidence could support questions. It could not always supply answers. And there was still one part of the letter detectives couldn't ignore. Its language. Because some of the phrases didn't sound like ordinary ransom demands at all. They sounded almost theatrical. The paper raised questions. The money raised questions. But it was the words themselves that divided investigators for decades. Could the language of the note reveal anything about the person who wrote it? A fingerprint can tell investigators who touched an object. Words can sometimes reveal how someone thinks, but only if you read them carefully. By the time detectives reached this stage of the investigation, the ransom note had become more than a list of demands. It had become a document to analyze. Every sentence, every phrase, every choice of words. The hope wasn't that the note would suddenly identify its author. It was that, taken together, the language might reveal something about the person who wrote it. Not their name, but perhaps their habits, their influences, or the impression they wanted to create. A small foreign faction. One phrase immediately stood out. The note claimed responsibility on behalf of a small foreign faction. It was an unusual way to describe the supposed kidnappers. Experienced investigators noted that real extortion or terrorist groups rarely introduced themselves in that manner. The phrase sounded oddly formal, almost theatrical. That observation led to different interpretations. Some investigators believed the wording felt deliberately dramatic. Others cautioned that unusual wording, by itself, could not identify the writer or their intentions. The phrase remained memorable, but not because it solved anything, because no one could confidently explain why it was there. As investigators continued reading, they noticed something else. The tone shifted. At times, the writer sounded calm and controlled. Moments later, the language became threatening, then strangely conversational. The note moved between confidence, anger, instructions, and long explanations. For some analysts, those shifts suggested a writer trying to sound intimidating rather than communicating efficiently. Others argued that people under stress, or attempting deception, can naturally write in inconsistent ways. Again, the document resisted simple conclusions. Every observation seemed to open another possibility instead of closing one. Over the years, some investigators and commentators observed similarities between certain phrases in the note and dialogue from popular films released before 1996. Among the movies frequently discussed were Dirty Harry, Ransom, and Speed. The similarities became a recurring topic in books, documentaries, and public discussion. But it's important to be precise. No court ever concluded that the note had been copied from a movie. No investigator established that a specific film inspired the writer. The comparisons were observations, not proof. Even so, they raised an interesting question. If the writer borrowed language from somewhere, why? Were they consciously creating a character? Trying to sound like what they imagined a kidnapper would sound like? Or were the similarities simply coincidences? The evidence doesn't settle that debate, but it explains why the wording has remained such an enduring focus. One of the most difficult questions investigators faced was also the simplest. How much can you really learn from words? Linguistic analysis can identify patterns. It can compare vocabulary, sentence structure, and writing habits. It can suggest possibilities. But it rarely delivers certainty. Language is flexible. People imitate others. They change how they write depending on the situation. And when someone intends to deceive, the challenge becomes even greater. The ransom note offered clues, but clues are not conclusions. That distinction mattered then. It still matters today. Despite years of analysis, one question kept resurfacing. Not, who does this sound like? But, what was this note trying to accomplish? If it was simply a ransom demand, why include so much unnecessary detail? If it was meant to frighten the family, why spend so much time explaining itself? And if it was meant to shape the investigation, what story was it trying to tell? For detectives, those questions became just as important as the handwriting itself, because before identifying the author, they first had to understand the purpose. Every investigation reaches a point where the evidence stops answering questions and starts asking them instead. The JonBenét Ramsey case reached that point almost immediately. By now, investigators had spent countless hours examining the ransom note, its wording, its length, the paper, the pen, the unusual demand for $118,000. Each discovery seemed important. Yet none of them answered the question everyone wanted answered. Who wrote it? That wasn't because investigators weren't looking. It was because evidence doesn't always point in one direction. Sometimes, it points in several. One of the first questions investigators asked was straightforward. Could the handwriting identify the author? Over the years, numerous handwriting experts examined the ransom note. Some believed certain individuals could likely be excluded as the writer. Others believed the writing shared similarities with known samples. Still others argued that the evidence was too inconclusive to support a reliable identification. The conclusions weren't unanimous. And that's important. Handwriting analysis can be a useful investigative tool, but it is generally considered less definitive than evidence such as DNA or fingerprints. In this case, it never produced the certainty investigators were looking for. The handwriting became another piece of the puzzle, not the solution. As forensic science advanced, investigators returned to the evidence with new technology. DNA testing became one of the most closely watched aspects of the case. Over the years, testing identified DNA from an unknown male profile on some of the evidence associated with JonBenét. What that DNA represents has remained the subject of significant debate. Some investigators and officials have viewed it as potentially important. Others have urged caution, noting that DNA can sometimes be transferred indirectly or originate from innocent contact, depending on the item and circumstances. The presence of DNA alone does not automatically explain when it was deposited or who committed the crime. As testing methods improved, the hope was that newer technology might provide clearer answers. So far, it hasn't resolved the case. As the years passed, different theories emerged. Some investigators believed the evidence pointed in one direction. Others believed it pointed somewhere else. Books were written. Documentaries produced. Experts disagreed. Former investigators sometimes disagreed with each other. And public debate often blurred the line between established evidence and personal interpretation. That's one reason this case has remained so difficult to discuss. Not because there are no facts, but because reasonable people have interpreted some of those facts differently. The challenge isn't a lack of information. It's deciding what weight each piece of information deserves. Nearly 3 decades later, some facts remain clear. JonBenét Ramsey was found inside her family's home on December 26, 1996. A 3-page handwritten ransom note was discovered before her body. Investigators determined the note had been written on materials from inside the house. The demand was for $118,000. The murder remains officially unsolved. Beyond those facts, the certainty begins to fade, and that's where responsible investigation requires humility. It's easy to mistake a persuasive theory for a proven conclusion. Much harder to accept that some questions remain unanswered. The ransom note never led investigators to the kidnapper it described. Instead, it became one of the most studied pieces of evidence in the entire case. But perhaps that's what makes it so unforgettable. Not because it solved the mystery, because it became part of it. Christmas was supposed to be the happiest day of the year for the Ramsey family. Instead, it became the dividing line between two lives, the one they had before December 26, 1996, and the one they were forced to live afterward. For investigators, the ransom note was never just a letter. It was a document that shaped the first hours of the investigation, directed attention toward a kidnapping, and then remained behind. Long after that explanation no longer fit the facts. Nearly 30 years later, the note continues to be examined, read, debated, not because it contains all the answers, but because it still asks some of the most important questions. Who wrote it? Why was it written inside the house? Why that amount? What story was it trying to tell? Those questions have outlived headlines. They've outlived television specials. And they continue to define one of America's most enduring unsolved murder cases. For JonBenét Ramsey, justice has remained elusive. For investigators, the search for answers continues. And for anyone who reads those 3 handwritten pages today, the mystery begins exactly where it did in 1996, with a document that was supposed to explain a crime, but instead became one of its greatest mysteries. JonBenét Ramsey's murder remains officially unsolved. Investigators continue to encourage anyone with credible information to come forward. What do you think happened? Share your theory in the comments. And if you enjoy evidence-based true crime documentaries, like, share, and subscribe for the next case.